Beneath Toronto's shining skyline lies a story stretching over 11,000 years, one that began long before a single brick was laid, at a crossroads of First Nations trails, where Toronto meant where trees stand in water. Every empire that followed claimed this land, from Huron-Wendat villages to British gunboats to glass towers housing 200 languages. But how did a sacred indigenous meeting place become a global metropolis, and what was lost or overlooked along the way? The answers upend everything you think you know about Toronto, and it all begins deep beneath the city's streets. Long before roads or city blocks, the land now called Toronto was shaped by hands that knew every bend of river and change of season. For more than 11,000 years, the ancestors of the Huron-Wendat and Petun nations moved through forests and along the northern shore of Lake Ontario, following ancient trails where the soil was rich and the waters full of fish. Their villages stood on high ground above the Humber, Don, and Rouge valleys, clusters of longhouses surrounded by fields of corn, beans, and squash. In spring, families gathered at the rivers for the salmon runs, setting rows of stakes into the shallows to guide the fish, an act so central it gave rise to the word Toronto, where trees to stand in water. Each year, these cycles of planting, gathering, and ceremony tied people to the land and to one another. The Toronto Corridor thrived as a meeting ground, a place where trade routes crossed and council fires burned. Here, alliances were forged, and knowledge was passed down. How to read the currents, when to burn the undergrowth for new growth, how to care for the earth so it would care for the people in return. Archaeologists have traced this deep stewardship in the layers beneath the city: stone tools, pottery shards, and traces of old gardens. But for those who remember, the story is not just buried in the ground. It lives on in the teachings of elders, in the names that endure, and in the responsibilities that remain. The land was never empty. It was and is a place of deep memory and careful tending, a foundation laid long before the first European footsteps ever reached these shores. Etienne Brule, a young French interpreter, set out in 1615 with Wendat guides, following the ancient portage routes that threaded through the forests and marshlands north of Lake Ontario. His journey westward from the St. Lawrence marked the first recorded crossing of a European into this region. Though the trails he traveled were already well worn by generations of indigenous traders and diplomats, Brule moved quietly along the Humber River, learning from his hosts how the land and water shaped every journey. Canoes lifted at the carrying place, fish caught at the narrows, stories exchanged by council fires. For the next century and a half, French traders and missionaries drifted through the Toronto Passage, drawn by the promise of furs and alliances. In 1750, the French built Fort Rueil near the lake shore, a wooden stockade trading post where beaver pelts and European goods changed hands. The fort stood for less than a decade, abandoned and burned by its own garrison, as British forces tightened their grip on the Great Lakes. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, the map had changed again. France ceded its North American territories, and the land around Toronto fell under British rule. These early encounters did more than redraw borders. They signaled the beginning of a new era, as the Toronto Corridor became a crossroads, not just for trade and travel, but for competing empires and lasting consequences. In the fall of 1787, British officials gathered with Mississauga leaders at the Bay of Quinte, presenting gifts, blankets, kettles, and gunpowder, intended as payment for a vast tract of land stretching from Etobicoke Creek to the mouth of the Don River and north beyond the future city. The British called it a purchase. For the Mississaugas, the exchange resembled a renewal of alliance and shared use, not a permanent surrender. The only surviving deed from that meeting was left blank, with 3 chiefs' totem marks attached later, and no clear description of boundaries. Confusion surfaced almost immediately. When surveyor Alexander Aitken tried to map the land in 1788, Mississauga objections halted his work. Even British officials admitted they could not say what exactly had been ceded. By the early 1790s, as Loyalist settlers moved on to the lakeshore, colonial authorities realized their legal claim rested on a document that described nothing. Anxiety grew. The new capital, York, would be built on land whose ownership was uncertain even by the Crown's own standards. In 1805, the British pressed the Mississaugas to sign a new agreement. For 10 shillings, the Crown claimed over 250,000 acres, land that would become Etobicoke, Toronto, North York, and Vaughan. The Mississaugas kept only a narrow fishery at Etobicoke Creek. The transaction, recorded in British legal language, ignored Indigenous understandings of land and relationship. Generations later, the boundaries and fairness of the Toronto Purchase would be contested in courtrooms and council chambers. But with this flawed agreement, the ground beneath Toronto was claimed, setting the stage for a city built on contested promises and unresolved debts. John Graves Simcoe arrived on the north shore of Lake Ontario in the summer of 1793, carrying with him a vision shaped by war and empire. The American Revolution had ended only a decade earlier, and the British were determined to anchor their presence in Upper Canada with a new capital, one that could withstand attack and command the inland waterways. Simcoe chose a sheltered bay, thick with forest and marsh, and named the settlement York, after the Duke of York. The site was remote but strategic, far from the American border at Niagara, yet close enough to the lake for supply ships and military movement. With just 10 settler families and a handful of soldiers, Simcoe's party began to transform the wilderness into a town. He ordered the construction of Fort York, its earthwork walls rising above the shoreline, cannons trained on the harbor's mouth. The fort was more than defense, it was a statement that British law and order had arrived. Simcoe's surveyors laid out a grid of straight streets, slicing through the bush in sharp lines. King Street, Front Street, and Yonge Street appeared on paper before any building stood, their names borrowed from London and the Crown. The grid imposed order on a landscape shaped for millennia by Indigenous trails and seasonal rhythms. Simcoe's plan reserved land for government, church, and military, setting aside wide boulevards and public squares in anticipation of a city that did not yet exist. The early settlers lived in rough log cabins, hemmed in by forest and mud, their daily life marked by isolation and uncertainty. Yet the blueprint held. Over the next years, new arrivals followed the lines drawn by Simcoe's hand, and York began to grow. The settlement's vulnerability, perched at the edge of empire, would soon be tested by war. But the foundations of Toronto's civic order, its streets, its fort, its sense of purpose, were laid in those first months by Simcoe's deliberate design. April 27, 1813, the morning air carried the sound of cannon fire as American warships anchored off the shore of York. Over 1,700 troops landed east of the town, met by hurried lines of British regulars, local militia, and a handful of Indigenous allies. The defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, fell back toward Fort York. In the chaos, British officers ordered the magazine destroyed to deny it to the enemy. The explosion shattered windows across the settlement and killed dozens, including the American commander, General Pike. Flames and smoke soon followed as the invaders set fire to the Parliament buildings, the fort, and the dockyards. Homes and shops were ransacked. For 2 days, York lay under occupation, its people forced to watch as the heart of their young capital was reduced to ashes. When the Americans withdrew, they left behind a battered landscape and a shaken community. But the people of York did not abandon hope. Rebuilding began almost at once. Carpentry tools replaced muskets. Women and men salvaged what they could from blackened timbers. Letters from the time speak of shared meals in ruined kitchens and neighbors working side by side to clear the debris. The militia, many of them farmers and shopkeepers, returned to their fields by day and stood guard at night, vowing never to be caught unprepared again. In the years after the burning, new buildings rose where the old had stood. Fort York's walls were rebuilt, stronger and higher than before. The town's population swelled as newcomers arrived, drawn by the promise of fresh opportunity and the determination of those who had endured the flames. By 1834, York counted nearly 9,000 residents, a city forged not just by war, but by the resolve to start again. The scars of 1813 became the foundation for a new civic identity, a place that could be wounded but not defeated. On March 6, 1834, the settlement once called York cast off its old name and became the City of Toronto. The change was more than a matter of letters on a map. It was an act of defiance, a declaration by nearly 10,000 residents that their battered town was ready to stand on its own terms. The new city council gathered in a brick meeting hall, its benches filled with the sounds of debate and the sharp voice of William Lyon Mackenzie, a Scottish-born printer and firebrand, chosen as Toronto's first mayor. Mackenzie was relentless, railing against the family compact, the small circle of colonial elites who controlled land, law, and money from behind closed doors. His newspaper, The Colonial Advocate, called out corruption and demanded reforms that would give ordinary people a say in their own affairs. But Toronto's birth was shadowed by crisis. The cholera epidemics of 1832 and 1834 swept through crowded lanes and shanties, killing hundreds. The poorest wards, packed with Irish immigrants, suffered the worst. Council records from those years are filled with urgent requests for clean water and better drains. Mackenzie pressed for action, arguing that a city worthy of its name could not ignore disease and poverty. The struggle for public health became tangled with the larger fight for political rights. By December 1837, anger and frustration boiled over. Mackenzie led a march of armed supporters down Yonge Street, aiming to overthrow the colonial government. The rebellion was short-lived. Loyalist militia scattered the rebels at Montgomery's Tavern, and Mackenzie fled across the ice to exile in the United States. The uprising failed, but its impact lingered. The city's streets, once mapped by imperial order, now echoed with the memory of protest and the promise of change. Toronto's experiment in self-government had begun with fire and fever, and with the stubborn hope that a city could be more than the sum of its rulers. In the years ahead, this restless spirit would shape its future as a place where reform and resistance were never far apart. Iron rails began threading their way north from Toronto in the spring of 1853, when the Ontario, Simcoe, and Huron Railway opened its first line to Bradford. Steam engines cut through farmland and forest, their whistles echoing across the lakeshore as workers laid track by hand, often in 12-hour shifts for $1 a day. The city's connection to the wider world changed overnight. By 1856, the Grand Trunk Railway linked Toronto to Montreal and the Atlantic, its lines running along the newly built Esplanade. Boxcars loaded with grain, whiskey, and farm equipment rumbled east and west, feeding the city's growing appetite for trade. Among the workers, stories circulated about a man known as Rail Joe McAllister, a name that stood in for the hundreds of Irish and English laborers who braved cold, mud, and dynamite to drive the rails forward. Their sweat and grit powered a transformation. Factories sprang up beside the tracks. Gooderham and Wirtz expanded their distillery into the world's largest, and Massey Harris shipped plows and reapers to farms across the continent. The city's population surged from less than 10,000 in mid-century to 44,000 by 1861, making Toronto Canada's second-largest city. Railways didn't just move goods, they pulled people and ideas into Toronto at a pace the old port could never match. Streets filled with newcomers looking for work and neighborhoods pushed outward, following the steel arteries that now linked the city to the world beyond. Brick warehouses and smokestacks crowded the eastern edge of Toronto's harbor, their silhouettes rising behind a tangle of rail lines and grain elevators. The largest of them all belonged to Gooderham and Worts, a distillery that by the 1860s was shipping more whiskey than any other in the world. Every day, wagons loaded with Ontario grain rolled through its gates, feeding a maze of copper stills and fermenting vats. The numbers were staggering. By the late 19th century, the distillery was producing over 2 million gallons of spirits a year, much of it bound for ports across the Atlantic. The scale of the operation drew in a workforce as diverse as the city itself: Irish and English laborers, German coopers, and black porters, their shifts marked by the bell that echoed over the Don Flats. A few blocks north, the clang of hammers and the whir of gears filled the air at the Massey Harris Works. Founded in the 1840s, Massey Harris grew from a small foundry into the world's leading producer of farm machinery by the 1890s. Its reapers and mowers transformed prairie agriculture, and its name appeared on crates shipped as far as Russia and South America. The company's payrolls listed thousands of men and women, some recruited directly off the arriving trains, who assembled steel parts in Montgay drafted halls. For many, a job at Massey Harris meant a steady wage, but also long hours and the constant risk of accident. Yet the promise of work drew families from rural Ontario and new immigrants from Europe, swelling the city's population and fueling demand for housing and services. By the turn of the century, Toronto's industrial might was measured not just in barrels and plows, but in the sheer density of its warehouse district. Grain dust hung in the air, and the risk of fire was never far from mind. Still, the factories and rail yards kept growing, their fortunes tied to the steel tracks that carried Toronto's ambitions outward in every direction. April 19, 1904, flames broke out in a neckwear factory on Wellington Street just after 8 in the evening. Within minutes, the fire leapt from building to building, fanned by a stiff wind and fueled by rows of wooden warehouses stacked with paper, textiles, and whiskey barrels. Fire Chief John A. Wallace led his crews into the heart of the inferno, racing horse-drawn engines down narrow lanes, but water pressure dropped as demand surged. The fire raged through the night, lighting up the sky for miles. By dawn, 20 acres of downtown lay in ruins, 122 buildings gutted, their iron skeletons twisted and blackened. The damage reached $10 million, a staggering sum for the era. No lives were lost, but more than 5,000 workers found themselves without jobs overnight. The city's core, once a dense maze of factories and warehouses, was reduced to smoldering piles of brick and ash. Yet out of the devastation, new rules took hold. City Council rushed to pass strict fire codes, mandating fireproof construction and modern hydrants. Insurance companies demanded safer buildings. The electric streetcar system, already spreading outward, became the backbone for rebuilding, linking new neighborhoods as the city annexed Parkdale, Seton Village, and Deer Park. Toronto's population, already over 208,000 by 1901, would only grow faster in the wake of disaster. The fire did more than destroy. It cleared the ground for a modern city, built stronger and ready to stretch beyond its old boundaries. In August 1914, recruiting offices across Toronto filled with young men answering the call to serve. Nearly 40,000 residents joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force, their names etched on honor rolls in church halls and train stations. Among them, Corporal Thomas Levy, a printer's apprentice from Spadina Avenue, left behind crowded row houses and the promise of steady work. His letters home described muddy fields in France, the thunder of artillery, and the longing for the city's familiar streets. The war's shadow stretched far beyond the trenches. At home, families waited for telegrams that too often brought news of loss. In 1918, a different threat swept through Toronto. The influenza pandemic moved swiftly, carried by returning soldiers and crowded streetcars. Hospitals overflowed, schools and theaters closed. By the end of the outbreak, around 1,600 Torontonians had died, more than the city lost in some entire battles overseas. The grief was raw and close, reshaping daily life in every neighborhood. The hardship did not end with peace. The Depression brought hunger and uncertainty. By 1933, 1 in 3 workers in Toronto was unemployed or on relief. Soup kitchens lined Queen Street, and families pawned wedding rings for groceries. Still, the city pressed on. When war returned in 1939, over 80,000 men and women from Toronto and the surrounding districts served in uniform. Factories switched from making radios and streetcars to producing tanks and aircraft. The sacrifices of these years demanded more than endurance. They forced leaders and citizens to imagine a city rebuilt for the people who had given so much. The blueprint for modern Toronto began here, in the resolve to survive and to build again. In the spring of 1954, Toronto's city planners gathered around a map that looked more like a puzzle than a city. 13 municipalities, each with their own council, their own priorities, and their own patchwork of services, were about to be woven together into a new experiment. Metropolitan Toronto. The old boundaries faded, replaced by a single regional government charged with coordinating everything from water mains to garbage collection. At the heart of this transformation was Miriam Chen, a civil engineer known for her sharp pencil and sharper questions. Chen's team pored over blueprints and census reports, convinced that only bold planning could keep pace with a city bursting at the seams. That same year, the first trains rumbled beneath Yonge Street. The subway, Canada's first, ran from Union Station north to Eglinton, carrying thousands of commuters who, until now, had relied on crowded streetcars. Above ground, the Highway 401 began its sprawl across the northern edge of the city. Within a decade, it would become the busiest stretch of road in North America, a concrete river channeling new arrivals into the suburbs. Chen's files from the era are filled with diagrams of expressways, transit lines, and green belts, evidence of a city bracing for a tidal wave of change. Immigration surged, new neighborhoods spread out from the core, and the post-war baby boom filled schools and playgrounds. The creation of Metro Toronto, the opening of the subway, and the rise of the 401 didn't just solve traffic jams. They set the foundation for a metropolis ready to welcome the world, linking old city streets to a future that would stretch far beyond the lake. In the decades after 1945, new voices and traditions began to fill Toronto's neighborhoods. Ships and trains brought families from Italy, Portugal, and Greece, each group drawn by the promise of steady work and a better life. On College Street, Italian bakeries and espresso bars served as gathering places for newcomers who had left behind war-scarred villages. In Little Portugal, the sound of fado drifted from corner cafes, and St. Mary's Church filled with prayers in a language that was once foreign to these streets. Greek arrivals found work in factories and diners, sending money home while building new routes along the Danforth. The city's population was swelling at a pace not seen before. By 1971, metropolitan Toronto counted over 2 million residents, almost double what it had been just a generation earlier. Census figures from the late 1960s show that Italians made up the largest immigrant group, followed by Portuguese and Greeks, their numbers reflected in the rise of new clubs, newspapers, and soccer leagues. Apartment towers and suburban bungalows filled with the smells of homemade bread and the sounds of children learning 2 languages at once. These arrivals did more than add to the city's size. They transformed its rhythms and rituals, blending old country festivals, with Canadian winters and reshaping the tastes and textures of daily life. What began as enclaves for survival soon became vibrant communities, each one adding its own color to Toronto's growing mosaic. The city was changing, not just in numbers, but in spirit, a place where the world's stories could find a new beginning. Steel and concrete began to redraw Toronto's horizon in the 1970s. In 1976, the CN Tower rose above the city's rail lands, reaching 553 meters, taller than any freestanding structure in the world at the time. Its slender silhouette became a new compass point, visible for miles, a signal that Toronto had ambitions on a global scale. Not far away, the city's appetite for reinvention found another outlet in the Toronto International Film Festival, launched that same year. What began as a modest showcase quickly became one of the world's premier film events, drawing stars and directors from every continent and turning King Street into a red carpet stage each September. By 1989, the Sky Dome opened its retractable roof to the sky, a feat of engineering that let baseball fans watch under sun or stars. It was more than a stadium, it was a statement that Toronto was ready for the world's spotlight. Urbanist David Bennett described these years as a time when Toronto stopped looking over its shoulder at Montreal or New York and started to define itself on its own terms. The city's energy spilled outward, but it also turned inward, questioning how to govern a place that had outgrown its patchwork of municipalities. In 1998, the province merged 6 cities and the old metro into a single Toronto, creating a megacity of 2.4 million people. The move was hotly debated. Residents voted 3-1 against it in a referendum, but the province pressed ahead, promising efficiency and unity. For the first time, Toronto became a single city in name and in law, its skyline and its council chambers finally reflecting the scale of its ambition. In 1967, the rules for who could call Toronto home changed forever. A new points-based immigration system opened the city's doors to the world, judging newcomers on skills and education rather than country of origin. Over the next decades, families arrived from every continent: Hong Kong, Jamaica, the Philippines, India, Somalia, each reshaping the city's sounds and streets. By 2016, census takers recorded a milestone. More than half of Toronto's residents identified as visible minorities, and over 200 ethnic groups spoke 160 different languages in daily life. For Sofia Garcia, who cheered the Raptors in Spanish and English with her friends on St. Clair West, the city's diversity was more than a statistic, it was the pulse of her neighborhood. In June 2019, as the Raptors clinched their first NBA championship, Sofia joined a sea of fans in Jurassic Park, waving flags from Colombia, Nigeria, China, and the Philippines. That night, Toronto's unity was visible on every screen, every street corner, every voice chanting, "We the North." But the city's shared pride would soon be tested. In 2003, the SARS outbreak swept through hospitals and neighborhoods, claiming 44 lives and leaving scars of fear and loss. 17 years later, COVID-19 brought the city to a standstill. Sidewalks emptied, storefronts shuttered, and families gathered on balconies to applaud frontline workers. Through each crisis, Toronto's neighborhoods leaned on one another, drawing strength from difference and connection. The rhythms of celebration and hardship wove together, forging a city that could not be defined by any one story, but by the way its people showed up for each other, again and again. The skyline stretches higher every year, but the ground beneath Toronto is shifting in ways that can't be measured in steel and glass. The price of a home now sits above $1 million, making ownership a distant dream for many. Renters face bidding wars, and families crowd into smaller spaces or move farther from the city's core. For newcomers and young people, the search for affordable shelter has become a test of endurance. On sidewalks and in parks, the signs of strain are hard to ignore, tents and makeshift shelters rising where old industries once stood. Population forecasts show Toronto's metropolitan area swelling past 8 million by the middle of this century. Each year, thousands arrive, drawn by the city's promise, adding new energy and complexity to its neighborhoods. But the pace of growth is outstripping the systems meant to support it. Subways and light rail lines are planned or under construction, with maps filled in for the 2030s. Yet for many, relief feels too far away. Congestion slows commutes, and the dream of a quick, seamless ride across the city remains just that, a dream. As Toronto looks ahead, the challenge is clear: to build a city that can house, move, and welcome all who call it home. The choices made now, in planning, in policy, in the daily acts of care and protest, will shape not just the skyline, but the lives lived beneath it. Toronto now stands as one of the world's most diverse cities, where over half the population was born outside Canada. As housing costs soar and its population surges toward 8 million, the city's next chapter of inclusion, equity, and resilience is being written in real time. The choices made today will define what Toronto becomes for generations. Its future, like its past, belongs to everyone who calls it home. What do you imagine for Toronto's tomorrow?